So previously we have seen how the cell sort algorithm is working. So let's now try to understand the code of the cell sort. So try to understand the working of this code in detail with one example. So the function takes one array containing all the unsorted elements, and then we pass the size of the array. Now inside the function, first of all, we have this outer for loop. Now this for loop is for the gap. So here we have the gap. So the gap will start from n by 2. N is the size of the array, and the gap will continue till gap is greater than 0. Now after each pass, we are going to reduce the gap size by half. That means in the first pass we're going to have n by 2, then we're going to have n by 4, then n by 8, and so on. So this outer for loop is to define the gap for each pass. Now inside that we have two nested for loop, and this is to perform the gapped insertion sort. We are basically performing the insertion sort but with a gap. Now to perform the gapped insertion sort, we have the nested for loop. Outer for loop has the I, which starts from gap and continue till the last of the array. And in each iteration, the I is incremented by 1. So because here the gap is 3, so that means the I will start from here in this position. So here the array indexing starts from 0. So the first one has the index 0, then 1, 2, 3. So the I will point to the gap, that means it will point to this index 3. And the I will continue till the last position of the array. And in each iteration it will increment it by 1. Now we're going to use this temporary variable which will hold this index value. So that means the temporary variable will have this value 6. Now inside the nested for loop, the j will start from I. So that means the index j will start from this I, and this nested for loop will be used to shift all the earlier gapped elements. So that means the j will start from I, and the loop will continue as long as j is greater than equal gap, and the value at the j minus gap position is greater than the temp. So that means we're gonna compare with the gapped position. So this is the j minus gap position. So this array j minus gap means this value. So we're comparing this temporary value with this j minus gap value. So if this j minus gap value is greater than this temporary value, then we're gonna shift this j minus gap value to this jth position. That means this value will be shifted to this position. Because this is less than the temporary value, so we do not need to perform any kind of shifting. Now in each iteration of the loop, we are going to reduce the j by the gap. So that means in each iteration of the loop, j will be reduced by the gap. So this way we are continue to compare with all the previous gap position, and we're gonna shift all of them to the right if they are greater than the temporary value. So because the 5 is not greater than 6, so that means no shifting needs to be done. That means we're gonna just put that temporary value back in the jth position. So that means this 6 will be put into this jth position without any kind of modification. So in the next iteration, the I will be incremented. It will point to the next value. So that means now the gap is shifted. Now the 3 will be put into this temporary variable, and we're gonna compare this with all the previous gaps. Now inside this inner for loop, we're gonna perform the comparison. So we're gonna compare with this j minus gap position. So because j minus gap is not greater than temp, so no shifting needs to be done. So we're gonna continue with the next pair of elements. So now the I is pointing to this 5th index. So now 1 will be put into this temporary variable, and we're gonna compare this with all the previous gap elements. So in the nested for loop, here we're gonna perform the comparison. So we're gonna compare this value with this j minus gap position. That means we're gonna compare with the value 8. Because the value 8 is greater than this temporary variable, So that means we have to shift this 8. So here we are performing the shift. So we're gonna shift this to this position, and then we're gonna reduce the j by the gap. So if we reduce the j by gap, it will point to this position which is less than the gap. So because the j is out of the bound, so because of this the inner loop will break, and now we're gonna put this temporary value in this jth position. So this 1 will be put into this jth position. Now in the next iteration of the outer for loop, the I will be incremented. So I will be pointing to this last index. So now the gap is shifted. So now 4 will be stored into our temporary variable. Now in the inner for loop, we're gonna perform the comparison. So we're gonna compare this temporary value 4 with this j minus gap position. So that means we're gonna compare with the value 6. So because 6 is greater than 4, that means we need to shift 6 to the right. So here we have performed the shift, and in the next iteration the j will be reduced by the gap. That means j will be pointing to this position. Now we're gonna compare this temporary value 4 with the previous gap position. So that means this is the new j minus gap position. So we have to compare these two elements. So because 5 is greater than 4, that means we need to shift 5 to the right, and again j will be reduced by the gap. Now if we reduce the j by gap, it will point to this position. So because now j is less than the gap, that means the for loop will break. And now we're gonna put this temporary value 4 into our jth position. So that means the 4 will be inserted right here in the 0th position. And now this loop will break. That means we are done with this pass 1. So you can see after the end of this pass 1, you can see the smaller elements now shifted to the beginning of the array. And that is the advantage of using the cell sort over the insertion sort. So because we are done with the pass 1, let's now go for the pass 2. So now the outer for loop will start. So that means we're gonna start the pass 2. Now in the pass 2, the gap will be halved. That means the new gap will be half of the previous gap. That means it will be 1. So now we're gonna perform the gapped insertion sort. Now these two inner nested for loop will again execute to perform the insertion sort. Now because the gap is 1, so this will work exactly like an insertion sort. So here in the inner for loop, the I will start from the gap. So gap is 1, that means I will be pointing to this 1th position. 2 will be stored into our temporary variable, and now the inner nested for loop will run. So here j will also be pointing to the same index position. So here we're gonna compare the j minus gap element with the temporary value. So that means this is the j minus gap element. So we're gonna compare these two values. So because 4 is greater than 2, so that means we need to shift the j minus gap element to the jth position. So that means this j minus gap element will be shifted to this jth position. And again j will be reduced by the gap, and now we're gonna put that temporary value in the jth position. So that means this 2 will be put into this jth position, and the index I will be incremented. Now 1 will be stored into our temporary variable. So that means we're gonna compare this with the previous element 4. So because 4 is greater than the temporary variable 1, so that means we need to shift 4 to the right, and again we're gonna compare with the value 2. So because 2 also greater than 1, so that means 2 also will be shifted to the right, and then 1 will be inserted right here in this first position. So now we're gonna compare these two elements. So the element 5 will be stored into our temporary variable. So now we're gonna compare this with the previous element 4. So because 4 is not greater than 5, so that means no shifting needs to be done. Again I will be shifted to the next index. This time 3 will be stored into our temporary variable. So we're gonna compare this with the previous value 5. So because 5 is greater than 3, so that means the value 5 will be shifted to the right, and then j will be reduced by the gap. So that means now we're gonna compare this temporary value 3 with this value 4. So because 4 is greater than 3, that means 4 will also be shifted to the right. So next we're gonna compare this 3 with the previous value 2. So because 2 is not greater than 3, so that means 3 will be inserted right here in the second index position. So in the next iteration, I will be incremented and it will point to the index 5. So now 8 will be inserted into this temporary variable. So that means we're going to compare 8 with the previous value 5. So because 5 is not greater than 8, so that means no shifting needs to be done. So that means in the next iteration, the I will be incremented and it will point to the index 6. So now the 6 will be stored into our temporary variable, and we're going to compare this with the previous value 8. So because 8 is greater than 6, so that means the value 8 will be shifted to the right. And again we're going to compare with the previous value 5. So because 5 is not greater than 6, so that means the value 6 will be inserted right here in the 5th index position. And this way this for loop will break. So that means we are done with the pass 2. Now this outer for loop will start. So this time again we're going to reduce the gap. So if we halve this gap, it will be 0. So because gap is not greater than 0, so that means this outer for loop will break. So that means we are done with the cell sort function. So you can see after the end of this function, all the elements are now sorted in ascending order. And this is the way the cell sort function is working to sort an array of elements. So hope you understand about the working of the cell sort function. So see you in the next one. Take care.